Hey guys, my name is Graham Johnson. Welcome back to Tabletop Glory, and today's video is a placeholder video. Basically, I just needed a little extra time to work on this week's project, so I recorded this in advance. I know not everybody's interested in model trains, so if you're not into model trains, go ahead and check out and go see some of my other content and come back next time and we'll have another video up for you. But today we're going to be talking about my model railroad. We're going to be talking about my plans for the model railroad and what needs to happen to make that happen. While we do that, I'm going to be playing in the background a live stream of me working on the coal cars for my model railroad. But let's go ahead and jump in with some of that pre-prepared footage as well as some still shots so we can talk about what the plan is. Hey guys, so we're going to be starting out our tour over here in the train yard. Now it's important to keep in mind that my layout is a large table with an L-shaped protrusion, which is the train yard. Now this train yard in the photo is about half the size of what it is going to become right now because of my limitations on space. It is the size that it is. The train yard is going to be one of the final things that it gets completed, despite it being the first thing I wanted to talk about in the video, as its placement directly resulted in the placement of the rest of the track on the layout. So the grand plan for things is once I am done building the track and I can ensure that there won't be any more derailments and that I can push the table up against the wall into its final location where it needs to go, then the train yard itself is going to have an additional 5 to 6 feet added to it on the left hand side here. Just beyond the station house there will be a 2-lane wide, about 3.5-4 inch deep shelf that's going to get added onto it. So you can see on the back side there that there are 2 re-railers laid out. That is the orientation in which I will probably have my 2 rails going all the way back. This is going to be my main line staging. Now, as of right now, there is no intention for these 2 lines to be connected together. However, at some point I may add a universal crossover up here near the top. Now, I'm saying the top as opposed to the front or anything like that, as this staging yard is actually going to be on a hill, which means that I will actively be able to use both staging lines as a kick yard. And although that doesn't really mean a whole lot when there's only 2 lanes, it's something that I wanted to practice playing around with, as if I ever end up rebuilding my layout or doing a different style layout in the future, I wanted to have some experience with designing a kick yard. Now, just a side note to keep in mind is my plan for this railroad is to use the extent of my hobby talents, everything that I've learned in the last give or take 6 or 8 years, and put that into a model railroad. So what you're seeing right now is kind of like my rough outline and my rough plan for where things are going to end up. Things are still kind of flexible and the terrain is still yet to be determined. That's why everything's going to be super flat. Now, this also having been said, I plan to add all kinds of really cool things. Like one of the things I plan to add to the machine shop or the station house is I plan to add some characters around that look like they're working on train cars, including blue flickering LEDs to simulate welding and other things like that. And I plan to hook all kinds of stuff up to push buttons. That way when I have my little cousins over, what the crap is in my eye? When I have my little cousins over, they can come over and play with things and actually have a lot of fun. It also means that when I have friends over during live streams, God bless the world, it means that when I have friends over to hang out on live streams while we run the railroad, everybody's going to have something to do. There's always going to be some little push button something or other that they can kind of play around with while they wait for the trains to get out of the way. Because we're not running a DCC layout. I would love to run a DCC layout. Don't own anything that's DCC. And a locomotive that is DCC is starting at $100. I don't have that kind of money to invest in things right now, and at some point it may turn into a DCC down the road once YouTube starts to bring in some revenue. I have no issue with upgrading what I have to turn it into DCC, but for right now, everything is going to be direct current. And for those of you who are not familiar and wonder what the hell DCC is, anytime you've ever watched a video on YouTube of model railroads where they're running multiple engines at once, that is a DCC layout more than likely. That is what allows people to control multiple trains at different speeds on the same tracks, even though, you know, under normal circumstances you wouldn't be able to do that. A DC layout like mine, you could not put two engines on the same track. They're going to go either the exact same speed, or if one has a slightly better engine, that one's going to go faster. There's no real way for me to run multiple engines on the same track, so I'm going to be isolating things so that power can be turned on and off to different tracks so that I can control things separately. This does mean that someone could be moving trains around in the yard using its own power completely separate from the main line. I'm not planning to set it up that way quite yet, but it will be at some point in the future when I have somebody over to kind of hang out and run the trains with. Now I want to take a second to talk about train hell. And for those of you who are a little confused on what I mean by train hell, the Y should be one of the simplest things on the railroad. Now, what do I mean by the Y? Well, the Y essentially refers to what you might think of as a train's way of making a 3-point turn to turn all the way around. In the case of the photo here, a train coming in off the main line where we can see it could pull forward, back up onto the other main line, pull all the way through the switch again, and then back up, back down the switching yard. Technically, that should be the extent of the Y. However, because of my limitations of space and because of where I'm going to have to put my engine house, I could not afford to put another switch in on the main line to bring the tracks into the yard house in a more efficient way than by running them right through the middle of the Y, which is how we've ended up with this weird crossing right smack in the middle of the Y. And I've done the math. I know that my engines can handle it. I know that it's not any kind of weird business that I'm going to have to worry about. It may cause derailments at higher speeds, but this is the train yard. You shouldn't be running the engines at higher speeds anyway, so it really shouldn't be a problem. It's just train hell, because you'll notice I have two stand-in switches here. There are 3 switches that make up the Y, a 4th switch to come into the train yard, 5, 6 switches that you can see here on camera. There is a 7th behind the engine house that you cannot see that has not been put in place yet. And if I do a universal crossover, that is an additional 4 switches. And even if I only do a single turnout, that is still 2 additional switches. So that is between like 10 and 12 switches that I don't currently own. And that's a lot of switches for one small area of the layout. Now, I admit, if I had a much larger train yard, there would be way more switches anyway, and this would be the least of my concerns. It's just, this was the best solution I could come up with. I spitballed ideas for this I don't even know how many times, and this was literally the best idea I kept coming back to. If you have a better idea for how I could have done this, where it would have been less rail spaghetti, you are more than welcome to suggest it in the comments, as since this will be one of the last things added to the railroad, there is still time to change things. But as of right now, due to space constraints, this was the best option I could come up with. Moving swiftly along, we're going to be talking about the left and right side of the railroad on the main table. Now, I affectionately like to refer to this as the low side and the high side, as the low side is going to be modeled to kind of roughly resemble a large thick forest and maybe be vaguely swampy in certain places, or at least to give the illusion that at one point it had been quite swampy. And then the high side is going to include our side where our coal mine is. Now we're going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. So I'll just show what that side looks like currently. Yeah, not much to look at. Back over on the low side of the railroad, let's talk a quick second about the town in which my railroad is set in. So I'm setting this in a fictional town in a fictional world, and although that town is yet to be named, feel free to put suggestions in the comments below. My first two industries we're coming across here is a logging camp and an animal feed processing plant. Now, in my universe, I'm planning to make it look as though a business has moved into this animal feed processing plant, perhaps an extension of the logging camp, and is now using this for sawdust processing. So this for more or less things like paper products, which will allow me to run a multitude of cars in and out of this facility, at least for when it comes to operational purposes. Now moving back over to the high side of the railroad, now this is going to get modeled to look like a mountain. So on the close side of the photo here, closest to us, you can see this ramp leading up. Now the track on the inside edge is going to duck into a tunnel, and then we have this switch protruding out, and that is going to be our coal mine facility. Now the tracks are going to be exposed for the most part until after the bridge, at which point it will then go into a tunnel. Now that tunnel is not going to come out on the low side, it's actually going to come out somewhere about in the middle, but I'm planning to cover this up with a large amount of trees, and I'm going to do some stuff to block some line of sight so that any light coming off the trains doesn't illuminate the room. I'm trying to hide the exit to this tunnel as I want to give the illusion that the railroad is much bigger than what it is, and I don't want you to be able to see where the trains are necessarily all coming and going from. Now some of the more astute of you may have remembered my little map from the very beginning and maybe wondered what the double loop was all about. Now hopefully this picture does a better job at showing it. So the outside loop starting at the Y becomes the inside loop roughly right before the bridge begins. It then goes down, connects into all the industry, goes into a tunnel, and crosses underneath itself, coming back up the outside edge of the board. I really like this double loop idea as it means that the train track, or necessarily I should say the train itself, has to travel roughly double the distance before interacting with any of the industry. This was something that I really wanted for operational purposes, so that when I ran it on live streams or for videos or even just for friends and family, I wanted it to feel like the train was actually having to put in some work as opposed to just leaving the yard and immediately pulling into the industry. I'm not yet currently 100% sure as to exactly what buildings are going to be involved with the coal mine, as I want this to feel kind of like a historical coal mine, something where it's more or less a tourist trap that is still functioning as a coal mine. It still provides money to the town, but it doesn't see a ton of business, so a lot of what's going to be there is going to be quite old, and so it'll probably more or less just be a bunch of outbuildings with this one singular tower that's currently there. In addition to this layout, I keep mentioning the bridge. The bridge is going to have a small river that goes underneath it and goes into a bit of a lake in the middle of the table. Now, on our current side of this bridge, there is going to be a large waterfall, as I'm actually going to be sculpting quite a large mountain for this entire corner of the table. And so, yeah, that's pretty much about it. The only other thing that hasn't been mentioned, which would have been a bit difficult to have shown you in those photos, is I'm planning to add a small concrete bridge to go over the river that's going to connect the rest of the area with the coal mine. And I'm going to put like a little touristy, like little souvenir shack thing out there as well, because again, this is meant to be like an old town that used to have a bunch of industry but doesn't anymore, and basically relies on tourism at this point. And then we're going to have a small, mostly dirtish gravel road that kind of leads over to the rest of the industry that is meant for the few trucks that still come through the area. There may be a small station platform over near the main train yard for passenger services, and that's just because I didn't plan to put any kind of passenger trains on the layout. However, I do have the ability to run passenger trains on my layout. So in any case, yeah, that's really all that's left to say until I get more of this railroad done. I will probably do some kind of an update video once I actually get some trains running, and I will be able to get trains running before the yard is finished just because of the way that I'm going to be building things. But for now, that's all I've got, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and for those of you who stuck through the whole video, thank you very much. It is much appreciated. This was a bit of a big video, and it was probably pretty boring for the most of you, so I do appreciate you guys hearing me out. If you guys would like to share any suggestions in the comments below for things that you think would be interesting for me to include on the layout, go ahead and do so. I've got a lot of really fun ideas that I didn't share in this video yet that I was inspired to add to my layout thanks to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. They've got a lot of really cool stuff on their layout, and I definitely plan to implement a lot of the things from their layout onto mine. But if you've got some suggestions of some stuff that I should look up and maybe get inspired by, feel free to let me know. In any case, I will see you guys in the next one.